everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD, anxiety, and anxiety spectrum disorders, and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss, and I'm a licensed therapist specializing in OCD and anxiety disorders. Thank you so much for joining me today. So typically this is a question and answer based podcast where you can send me questions about OCD, anxiety disorders, what your experience is, any questions or advice you're looking for, any guidance, and I'm more than happy to answer that. You can send me a question by going over to fearcastpodcast.com and clicking on the submit a question link. You can also send me a question over at Instagram. I'm Fearcast Podcast over there. If you send me an audio question by sending me a DM with the just recording your audio through that, that's probably the easiest way to get a question. That tends to go to the top of the list, and I will get that on as soon as I can. But again, if you send in any question, even if it is audio, or even if it is not audio, just a text one, I will get it. I will read it, consider it, and likely put it up on a future episode. Today is going to be a little bit different. Today I have a guest on. Today I have Mike Heady, who is joining me to talk about shame, which I know is a super exciting conversation or a super exciting topic, but it actually really, really is. Mike was so kind to join us today to share with us some of his expertise in shame, just what the experience is, what the emotion is, and how it relates to toxic shame, and also how it relates to and his experience within OCD and anxiety disorders. And he shares some really great tips on how to start building your awareness of shame and how you can start working with it and growing through it, and through it, with it, and despite it, I think might be a fair way to say it. But either way, it was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed this chat. I won't waste too much time. Let me just tell you a little bit about him. I'll read you his bio, and then we'll just jump right into it. So Mike Heady is a LCPC and is the co-owner and co-director of the Anxiety and Stress Disorders Institute of Maryland, where he has specialized in the treatment of OCD, anxiety disorders, and related conditions for the past 16 years. He's a faculty member of the IOCDF's Training Institute, a clinical fellow with the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, and is on the advisory board for OCD Training School. He is a regular presenter at the annual conferences for the IOCDF and ADAA, and he provides regular consultation for therapists. He's produced numerous professional webinar trainings for ERP and ICBT for OCD, and has appeared on several podcasts discussing shame, intimacy, perfectionism, and other OCD-related issues. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Mike Heady. All right, Mike Heady, thank you so much for joining us on the Fearcast today to talk about everyone's favorite subject, shame.
I wish it was more of everyone's favorite subject, but it's one of my favorite subjects. So I'm glad you were having me on to talk about it.
Absolutely. Well, this conversation was a ways in the making, and I'd become aware of you through the ICBT world and kind of your connection with that, and just also seeing some of your talks on ICBT and just getting to know you a little bit here and there. I'd reached out to you to talk about shame as something that you are interested in, both, not both personally and professionally, but at the very least professionally. So appreciative to have you on to chat about what it is. So I guess to start us off, why don't we just define the terms? What is shame? Because as we were talking beforehand, there's a bit of a misunderstanding about what shame is, what its role is, why we have it. So why don't we just start with the basics? What is it?
Sure. Yeah. What is shame? Shame is it's a universal experience. I think the shorthand we can use for it is emotion. although there are some affect theorists that would say it's an affect. It's not an emotion. It is what gives rise to emotions. But that's a whole rabbit hole we don't need to go down. For today's purpose, it's just a core emotion. And it's not unlike fear is a core emotion, and joy is a core emotion, and anger is a core emotion, shame is a core emotion. So we're all sort of wired to experience it. And there's probably evolutionary value in that, right? That evolution is an efficient process. It doesn't keep things around that don't need to be around. So the capacity for us as social creatures to feel shame probably has some value. And I can go into that later. So shame is like a really painful, self-conscious emotion. It is a recognition that the self, us, independent of any person or thing, just us internally, is somehow stepping out of line from what we agreed to do or agreed to function as. And so fundamentally, shame is good, which I know is going to make people like their hair on fire. Right. Shame is actually good to have. I mean, there's that famous quote, "Have you no shame?" That there's a good amount of shame. There's healthy, functional shame, right? And then there's the other shame, the one that we spend a great deal of time talking about and researching and treating. And we can call that dysfunctional shame, maladaptive shame, compassion-focused therapy. People, Paul Gilbert, call it high shame. And John Bradshaw in the 90s with his self-help books called it toxic shame. And I like that phrase, toxic shame. But that's shame in a nutshell.
I like it. Thank you. And actually, I'm kind of curious, what is it about the word toxic shame that seems to resonate with you versus some of those other descriptors?
I
mean, it's snappy and catchy. There's that.
It is. Well, there's that. It's colloquial. We understand toxic relationships to be, that there is some interaction that's problematic and we really kind of need to break up with it. And I think like maladaptive and dysfunctional are psychological terms that are unnecessarily long and hard to spell. So why don't we just go with toxic? And it really gets to the point. I mean, toxic shame is shame plus a problematic relationship that we probably need to break up with, and that really is where the treatment is focused, is on the toxic part, right? It's not unlike anxiety and anxiety disorders, if you will, right? Like, we don't treat anxiety in the sense that you're going to eradicate the capacity to get anxious. We want to get anxious. That's a good survival process for us to have. We don't want an anxiety disorder in the sense where it's happening when it ought not to happen. It's happening at a level or for a length of duration that is beyond useful. And that is anxiety plus a toxic kind of relationship, if you will. Again, boiling it down to some overly simplistic basics.
Right. And I think that the way you described that is makes it a really functional way to think about it, right? It is this natural, normal human emotion that to certain degrees is good, is wanted. It's when it starts to become problematic. I've thought about anxiety kind of like a bell curve, right? Quote, normal anxiety exists in the middle of the bell curve with the vast majority of us in it, right? We feel a little bit more anxiety with things, less anxiety. When they fall into the tails, the very extreme of it, where you're feeling a lot of anxiety, that's where we start to call it a disorder. It is out of order of what the average person would be feeling or triggered to. And similarly, the people at the other end of the tail where they don't feel enough anxiety, colloquially, people call them crazy. It's the people who are, free soloing Yosemite or El Capitan. I'm not. That guy doesn't have enough anxiety. He needs to have more anxiety.
Yeah. There was an NPR podcast. I'm going to forget the name of it, but it featured a story of a woman who had a calcified amygdala. and didn't experience normal, healthy amounts of anxiety. And it got her into a fair amount of trouble. So, yeah, I mean, there's that sort of Goldilocks zone of emotional experience, emotional reaction. And when we start getting outside of that zone, I think we start getting more and more interference in sort of functioning in one way or the other. And I see shame falling into that. You know, what's most common, at least in the reading, the research I've done and things I've heard in the years I've been in practice, is you only really hear about the bad shame, the shame that has, carried, from traumas that society has forced onto people to shame you, to try to silence you. And while that exists, that's not the same thing as, our capacity, our brain's capacity to experience an emotion, right? That there is a functional kind of shame. I can give like an analogy if it's helpful for people. If you've had a car that's been built sometime in the last few years, it probably has a safety feature called lane departure software, right? Lane departure technology. You're driving on the highway and there's this little camera or sensor that's sensing the lanes. And if you start to drift into the other lane, your steering wheel shakes and the light goes off and you sort of jostles you back into the lane. Assuming the technology works, which, it's a big assumption, it corrects course. It keeps you on course. And I think shame is kind of our own internal lane departure software. We're all social creatures. Our survival depends on cohesion within the social group. We all agree internally on basic ideas and premises of how we live. And when shame gets activated, good shame, healthy shame is activated when we veer outside of that. To have a self-reflect and self-correct. And then it disappears. It does what it's intended to do and it moves on.
Right.
That's healthy shame. The bad shame, the toxic shame, that's the stuff that doesn't move on. It doesn't lead to useful experiences or useful responses, and it tends to haunt you.
Before we jump into the definitions then about toxic shame and how that's experienced, and then we'll certainly get into how it is experienced within OCD and anxiety spectrum disorders, I think some people with the definition of shame you've given might conflate that with guilt.
Yeah, I mean, I conflated it with guilt for a while. I'm like, what, are we just talking about the same thing here? And, the researchers are consistently parsing this stuff out. Like, they are different. They're not semantically the same. They're quite different. And where I have read and agreed on the differences, it boils down to this for me, that guilt is usually about a behavior in the context of an other. Other could be another person, like a coworker, a best friend, a parent. Other could be something ethereal like God or the universe, or other could be something like the environment. But there's a behavior in the context of an other, and what gets highlighted, right? What gets the spotlight or the floodlight shown onto it with guilt is the behavior done to the other, which then often leads to what they call pro-social or functional repair attempts. You can apologize, right? You can confess. You can make a repair attempt for the relationship. You can adjust a behavior to then correct, right? So it's like, if I did a bad thing, I feel like maybe I could go donate some money or, volunteer my time for Habitat for Humanity. So guilt is actually not so much associated with mental health problems from the research perspective. Shame, on the other hand, is shining that same spotlight, not on a behavior in the context of others, but on yourself, capital SELF, the innermost person. And it is about an attempt to self-correct based on your own expectations of what you agreed upon and think are right. So it doesn't involve or require an other. So there's a huge sort of demarcation in this piece where I would make the argument, although I don't know that it's empirically supported yet, that if you're going to feel guilt, you're also going to feel shame, because I would suspect that guilt is built upon the scaffolding of shame. And to recognize that I've had an impact on an other also makes you self-reflect that you did a thing you ought not have done. Right? Again, this is healthy shame we're talking about here. And there could be a situation where I experience shame, but there's no other in sight. There wasn't a behavior that affected another at all. It was just me in my own sort of self, and I broke some kind of rule or expectation. And so that's not, what's that? That's not guilt. Who am I going to apologize to? Myself? You know? So there is a line that I think is useful to separate the two. And I like this idea of the spotlight highlighting what seems to be wrong. Guilt, it's the behavior in the context of an other. And shame, it's, you know, a behavior, a thought, a thing, but only in the context of the self.
Is it, in a sense, can you view the self as the self is the person, the entity that you are needing atonement with, that you are reaching out to get right?
Yeah, you could make that case, right? That this is not an external other. This is an internal you, right? And that an observer you, if you will, can look at you who cheated on a test that no one knew about,
right?
And wants to self-correct, you know? And so I make the argument, as some others have, that there are emotions that are part of the tree of shame, sometimes referred to as shame-anchored emotions, that shame creates a scaffolding where other emotions like embarrassment exist, humiliation, mortification, chagrin. These are all self-conscious emotions, right, to some degree or another. They're not about fear. They're not about danger. They're not about threat. They're about social cohesion. They're about the self. They're about being in alignment with this sort of group. And if I can nerd out for like 30 seconds,
I'll allow it.
There's been some emerging research that I would love to see more on, talking about how shame, which is largely considered to be that of the social animals, right? We don't tend to see it, or don't know how to look for it in the non-social animals, that it's actually likely built on the same architecture as disgust, which is a much older, much more primitive, experience of living creatures. Is disgust as a reaction to things that could kill you, that could, that you ought to stay away from, right? And since evolution is, economical, it's efficient. It loves to recycle. It loves to reuse. It's not going to build a whole brand new scaffolding for this now evolved social animal. It's going to say, well, what do we have that will help this thing thrive in this new social environment? We have disgust, but what if we made disgust but pointed towards the self?
Right.
Right. And so shame is often seen as disgust towards the self.
I think that adds a whole extra flavor on it too, kind of viewing it as this, we all know what disgust feels like, and there's a disgusting feeling when you're experiencing shame of, I'm grossed out by me. I don't like the thing that I have done to somebody else. Again, I think we're kind of, this is now veering into guilt territory, but it's that bad. I've kind of clunkily, if that's even a word, it defines itself, but it clunkily defining them as, guilt is that bad feeling when we've done something bad. Shame is that bad feeling when we feel we are something bad. Yeah.
And again, I further break that down, but I like that simplistic break that I've done something bad in the context of an other,
of a relationship,
right? Again, of a relationship, right? And how you define that can be how you define that, but shame again is so much more about this. It doesn't require an other at all, unless you consider sort of the self as a different part. And then we're getting to sort of philosophical.
Yeah, that can be its own rabbit hole that perhaps we'll jump down. Right. So kind of in seeing the differences between these two, the guilt element, the shame element, we've talked about how both of those can be helpful in a sense of turning us back towards personally valuable actions, activities, relationship styles, behaviors, etc. So when does it turn into toxic shame? When does it become problematic for somebody?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's hard to sort of start in one place because it's a really big question. But toxic shame begins when we start trying to relate to it in a way that is about escaping it, controlling it, avoiding it, not unlike anxiety. That's when anxiety is a problem, is shame becomes a problem, because we stop being able to listen to it, right? I shared with you before we chatted that there's a few quotes I really love that guide my understanding of relationships to emotions. David Barlow's great quote that, emotions have signal value, right? They're signaling something to you, and they're trying to tell you something, communicate something to you. Susan David's quote, emotions are data, not directives. Data, it's information. They're not necessarily, things you must go do, but there's certainly valuable information there. And so it becomes toxic when we have a repeated way of relating to it that isn't about listening to it. It's about trying to escape or control it. And this is where we get into trying to make sense of how we do that. How do we try to escape and control it in ways that are toxic and problematic? And I'm happy to jump into that if you'd like.
Let's jump into that.
Let's jump in. So a couple years ago, the pandemic has me on pandemic time, probably 5 or 6 years ago. My coworker, former supervisor, mentor, Carl Robbins, and I, we worked together. He's very much a nerd. I say that lovingly. And he does deep dives into everything. And he got hooked into shame and how it was relevant to treating OCD, anxiety disorders, depression, and did a number of talks to our Wednesday staff meeting about it, where really piqued my interest. And I did my own deep dive into it along with him. And a lot of reading from a lot of different sort of perspectives. But the one that seemed to capture me the most, that Carl introduced me to, was a psychoanalytic psychiatrist named Donald Nathanson. And, he was, back in the 80s, just completely focused on shame. Now, he was focused on it from a psychoanalytic perspective. Surprise, surprise, the 80s. That was still sort of the du jour, if you will. And he came up in 1987 with a graphical representation that he called the compass of shame. And if you would sort of close your eyes and imagine, the listeners can do this, close your eyes and imagine.
If you're listening to this podcast while driving, don't listen to Mike. Keep your eyes open. But go ahead.
Keep your eyes open, and do it later. But like you can imagine a compass. It's got 4 poles, right? North, south, east, west. And each pole of the compass represents a reaction to shame. Now, I say these are toxic reactions or toxic relationships. That's not something Nathanson said, but I sort of edited it a little bit for my own purposes. So they are the following. I don't think they need to be in any particular order, but let's say the north pole of the compass is what we might call appeasement behaviors in animals, right? The tail between the legs, the eyes wide open, but head down. In humans, it's getting quiet, silent, and small. It's known as withdrawal. And so when we start to feel shame of any kind, little shame like embarrassment, big shame like humiliation, one of the ways we can respond to it is to withdraw, to get quiet, to get silent, to get small. If you think to yourself, have you ever been to a conference, been wandering around looking for a familiar face, and you finally see someone and you wave and you go, hey, and then it's not who you think it is, and then you cover your mouth.
Embarrassing.
And that whole covering of the mouth is another withdrawal. I'm getting quiet. Yeah, right. I'm hiding. So that's withdrawal. That's pretty obvious. It's pretty basic. It's not the one we tend to focus on the most, but it's there. The south pole of this compass is avoidance. Which us in the anxiety and OCD world know all too well. Avoidance, the bread and butter of how we cope in unhelpful ways. So this is avoidance of people, places, things, avoidance of memories. I throw in here perfectionism as a behavior, because, and I get a lot of this from the compassion-focused therapy crowd. Paul Gilbert and company talk about the idea of perfectionistic behaviors as actually sometimes functioning to avoid or escape shame.
Yeah, I think Brene Brown talks a little bit about that as well, as a effortful attempt to not feel a bad feeling with whatever that might be.
Yeah, and some people might refer to it, I forget this, the therapists, probably a couples therapist or family therapist, said it was avoiding a one down position, right? Where it's that I need to just be above rejection and failure and ostracization. So I need to be perfect here. I need to have perfect attendance to make up for feeling like I'm not a good person. So that's avoidance, and we can dive into that, but I think we understand that for the most part.
Yeah.
The east pole of the compass is attacking others. And this one looks kind of like, being passive aggressive, being verbally aggressive, being physically aggressive, silent treatment. When someone, real or perceived, has tried to make us feel small, tried to shame us, and again, it could have been deliberate or inadvertent, we often can feel a sense that we want to make them feel as small as us. We want to sort of defend in this way, and it can be attacking the others. So when I feel shame, and if I imagine it's someone who made me feel this way, I'm going to want to attack the other person.
Yeah, I could certainly see that as, if we're feeling kind of bad about ourselves or bad about something we've done, we can lash out at other people that we love. We can be rude or snide or say those things that we don't want to say.
Yeah, if you think like, a typical relationship where someone says, hey, I have a problem I'd like to talk to you about. If the person's really defensive, they hear the problem and then globalize it and be like, well, I'm just a terrible husband then.
Yeah.
That's an attack others shame response. You feel shame because someone brought up something about your interaction with them that wasn't great. And instead of sort of hearing that, you reacted to the shame of that with an attack that was, well, I guess I'm just a horrible, terrible husband, and I'm going to turn this around on you and make you say, no, I don't think you're a horrible, terrible husband, right? Like,
yeah, I hear that disgust element in that too, that feeling of I can't have this at all. I need to push this away from me as much as I can, and I want to push this on you for even bringing it up.
Exactly. Yeah, that tends to be how it shows up. And the last one, I think probably the most pervasive and probably even the most obvious, is to attack the self. We get into self-criticism, right? Self-punishment, attacking one's character.
Self-deprecation.
Right? Self-deprecation, being the butt of a joke, but you're not really in on the joke, right? You actually feel like you're a bad, below, broken, polluted person. And so attacking the self is a very common experience for people in a toxic relationship. So all 4 of those poles capture a great deal. I wouldn't say all, but it's a shorthand. Captures a great deal of the different kinds of responses we can have that set up the stage for a toxic relationship to shame. Because now you're trying to escape the emotion itself, not listen to what it might have to tell you. And then you're off to the races trying to withdraw, avoid, be perfect, attack others, or attack yourself.
Right. It's interesting. They are, all of them, for the most part, are pulling you away from relationship. They are, in and of themselves, isolating.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And they can really punctuate that message that I'm not good enough. And we do that to ourselves by running away, pushing somebody else, pushing other people away. Kind of that idea of appeasement, getting distant, getting small, getting quiet. It's I'm not going to reach out to make this right together. It's I need to be shunned, in a sense.
Yeah. And appeasement behaviors in animals have a functional relationship when it's hierarchical, right? They think like wolves, like appeasement behavior amongst wolves makes sense, right? There's an alpha and you need to not sort of take the big piece of meat, right? And there's a structure and a hierarchy and a way things are done. And so appeasement behavior is a signal, I get it, right? I get it.
You're the big dog here.
Right. And now in our modern world, that doesn't really function in the same way, right? I will say, and I probably would have gotten to it later, but I'm sort of preempting some people's questions that they might have as they're listening, which is, when I say shame has something to teach us, that doesn't always mean that your reaction to shame is just, right? That you should feel shame, right? Sometimes you shouldn't feel shame. Think of waking up from a dream where behaviors happened that weren't real. You might feel shame upon waking, but that's a bad, scary dream, and you don't need to own that shame, and you don't need to practice self-compassion for that. That was a dream. That was a made-up circumstance that provoked, right, the ability to feel shame. Sometimes what shame has to teach us is that it's bullshit, right? That it came from a scary story, which is often true in OCD, that it came from a bad dream, that it came from some other person trying to tell you not to be you, right? But you don't need to own that shame, right? If you know, oh, that person's trying to shame me, well, it's their problem, really. But if you react to your own shame in this knee-jerk, habitual way of, I'm just going to run, escape, attack, you never actually learn that where it came from wasn't something you had to own. It doesn't require a self-correction on your part, which is what shame is always intended. Good, healthy shame, always intended to promote self-correction, right? And when we have these toxic relationships, we end up doing everything but self-correction, right? We think on some level beating myself up is self-corrective, right? Kristen Neff goes into this when she talks about self-esteem and self-compassion. She says that a lot of people think that giving yourself self-compassion is indulgent, right? It's like this thing that I don't deserve to do. I need to pick myself up on my bootstraps and hold myself accountable. And that's another way of saying self-criticize, masquerading as self-correction.
I hear these things all the time from people, from clients I work with. On the one hand, yes, certainly they'll hear that self-compassion, and they'll twist self-compassion to say it's okay, or I am okay in my entirety, and there's nothing that I can do wrong, as if to say that's what self-compassion means. Or the other side is, it's the justification of the compass. I do this so that I'm a good person. I do this so that I can learn from this and improve, right? I should be doing this to myself, or avoiding, or maybe not attacking. That's a rough one, but certainly that self-deprecation and that excessive self-criticism. They argue that it's good,
right? And of course, we can kind of put the lie to that very fast with a simple intervention by saying, at what age do you teach your own kids to self-criticize, to self-shame, to attack one's character, to be perfectionistic. Like, at what age do you teach them to do that, to handle experiences that are negative, right? To handle a failure or a mistake, or real or perceived failures or mistakes. Like, we would never, ever teach our kids to do that. Like, inevitably, when I say this to a client, they're like, well, I wouldn't teach my kid, but somehow I'm different.
Is it I'm different, I'm special, I need this more than the other kid?
Or it could be that I can't help it, that this is just how I am. They throw their hands up. Yeah, so I throw my hands up in the air. I'm wired this way. And giving them a sense of hope, like, nope, this isn't about how you're wired. This is actually a behavioral thing. And it's a relational thing, and we can change these things, but we first have to become aware of them. And the step, we would say, of any good therapy intervention is first awareness, right? If we're talking about people who have BFRBs, step one, awareness tracking. Right. Same thing with OCD. What are your compulsions? What are your obsessions? Get to know it. Shame is the same way, right? If you have a toxic response to shame, I want to know it. I want you to track it. And I'm going to give you that compass to just give you a helping prompt to look at the different ways that I relate to these emotional experiences, because they're also going to be a compass for treatment. Right.
Yeah. And kind of, I would imagine within that compass, people gravitate more towards some poles than others, and knowing which ones get to you are going to help define how it is that you can help combat that, or how you can best how you can best change some of those things for yourself to be in a more functional and adaptive state with that feeling.
Yes. Ultimately, the goal is to only have the adaptive Goldilocks zone of emotion, where it's providing a function, it's fleeting like all emotions ought to be, that we're not sort of anchored, stuck feeling this one thing and then perpetually trying to run from it.
Right. In terms of building that awareness, what are some things that you recommend on how to, for someone who's listening to this podcast and they're experiencing shame, or they've got a loved one who's experiencing shame, what are some ways that they can start to build the awareness that toxic shame is happening, and then they're getting into a toxic relationship with it?
That's a good question. I think a good place to start is, how long are you sort of trapped in this shame feeling as you might be experiencing it, right? You might not think it's toxic at this point. You might just think, I'm feeling this feeling of shame. How long are you there for? Because if you're there for minutes or hours or days, some process is keeping you there, right? And it's probably no longer functional, right? Shame is that lane departure software, right? It jostles you and then it's done, right? You identify a self-corrective path and then it's done.
Provided you make the adjustment.
Right, exactly. Provided you make the adjustment, or there's an adjustment to be made. But in that ideal circumstance, like fear doesn't linger for hours upon hours, right? Unless you're still in the actual dangerous scenario, right? So I would start with that. How long have I been trapped in this? And then I would go into, do you realize how you're responding to this, right? Like, the first thing I would look out for, and I think, again, it's probably the most pervasive, is self-criticism, some form of self-criticism. You're being unkind, impatient, intolerant with yourself. You're ruminating on it. You're chewing on it again. You're talking about it a lot. This is no longer about self-correction, right? This is about something else. So I'd start there. And, again, I'm a huge fan of that compass, as imperfect as it may be. Can I take a look at that compass, take a look at the recent event I've been experiencing, and see which of these four, maybe it's all four, maybe it's just one, I'm doing. Of course, trying to get someone to agree that what they're doing is actually unhelpful can be a bit of a mountain to climb, right? We talk that some people have beliefs that being self-critical is actually helpful, right? That being self-critical holds you accountable. It makes you not repeat the mistake. And there's a conflation there, right? Like I'm conflating, holding myself accountable with beating myself up. And beating yourself up is not the solution to anything. But again, that's further down the road. I think it starts with, I'm stuck in a feeling. I'm chewing on it. I'm being unkind to myself. It's lasting a long time. This has ceased to be about a healthy relationship to an emotion. And then we can dig further and go where it tells us to go.
Right. Should we take a brief shift into looking at how shame shows up for people in experiencing OCD?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Go ahead.
You want me to start? Yeah, I can do that. Sure. I mean, I don't think it's a surprise that OCD is not, an anxiety disorder in the sense that the only thing you feel is anxiety. Right? Anxiety is a disorder of obsessions and compulsions. And we use anxiety as a shorthand to describe it, right? It's a disorder where you get distressed from obsessions. But what does that distress mean? Distress can be guilt, it can be shame, it can be disgust, it can be fear and anxiety. So when we're talking about shame showing up, it is a different animal here because most people don't want to talk about it, right? People are much more free to talk about fears. They're not so free to talk about the things that might make them feel ashamed. So a way of thinking about this is some people feel shame just from having a diagnosis, right? And a mental health diagnosis in general, but OCD in particular, because it seems to be the butt of a lot of jokes. We see this in campaigns for marketing where it's seen as a joke, right? That in TV shows of misrepresenting it and this is weirdo with this OCD, and people misuse it all the time. I'm so OCD because I have to do a certain thing. So if you have a diagnosis of OCD, there's a tendency for a lot of people to sort of see it already as a shame, right? That I have this thing, I'm broken, I'm weird, I'm something I don't want to be. So it can start as early as that. Just getting the diagnosis makes you want to sort of hide from it, not accept it. And that can lead to avoiding treatment. There's certainly data on that. So shame can come at that level. Shame can come from the level of the content of one's obsessions.
Absolutely.
Right? We talk about taboo, which isn't my favorite way of describing it. But certainly this idea of repugnant to us obsessional content, what if I'm a serial killer? What if I want to hurt animals? What if I want to hurt kids? So all of those more taboo, repugnant to self obsessions are, I think, way more likely to provoke shame than they are to provoke fear or threat, and far less likely to be communicated to a professional. Because that's another area of shame that we see a lot in our community is that untrained, perhaps well-intentioned professionals hear things and they're like, oh, that's not OCD. Like, you're not washing your hands, like, you don't have OCD. Ugh. Stop trying to, you have OCD because you think TikTok told you had OCD. You don't really have it. So you're shaming someone when you do that, right? The message is shame. You might get shame from a professional who doesn't understand the content of your obsessions and thinks you're a danger. We've certainly seen this where people have been hospitalized for what if I want to commit suicide obsessions. What if people having CPS called for what if I'm a pedophile obsessions. And so that is a massive problem in the helping field in general, is this misunderstanding and this overreaction to sort of cover one's ass through a referral to something before understanding what's really going on for this person.
And the function of the thought and the function and the experience of that content. It's very different.
Yes, absolutely. Because you think a person, already knows I don't want these thoughts.
Right.
They're already antithetical to who I am. I can't get rid of them, so I'm terrified. I'm going to tell a doctor I have these thoughts, and they're going to be like, I think you're a risk to people. Oh my goodness, that's only going to make the OCD worse. That's
this person of authority. They're saying, I am a problem, and they're agreeing that these thoughts are true and real.
Yeah, it is. I don't know how to solve it other than just constant education and advocacy, but it is a huge problem and a very big source of shame. Societal shame kind of falls into that too. Messaging you've got around mental health, messaging you've got around OCD in particular. Same thing with messaging about treatments. Oh, you take meds, you're a crazy person. You see a shrink. That, it's a lot less common, at least today, than it was when I was a kid.
It's certainly getting better.
It feels like it's getting better. I don't know if it's true everywhere, but it feels like it's getting better. The last piece I'll say, and then you and I can sort of riff back and forth, is that shame can also come from overt compulsions. People sometimes miss that one. Like the person who's driven to do a behavior that looks weird, they know it looks weird, but they have to do it because they are completely immersed inside of a fear story that says, you better do this or else.
Or else.
Right? And that or else is so compelling that it doesn't matter how weird it looks to someone else. I have to do this thing repeatedly.
Right.
And growing up with that and having people give you that message that you're so strange, you're so weird. Like they know that this is a thing that they're doing that other people see as weird. And so overt compulsions can be a very big source of shame too, because they're often getting that feedback from their peer group, from their parents, from schools. That's another thing we want to mention.
It's such a frustrating double message or double standard that we send. It's trust your gut, listen to your feelings, be honest. But then, my feelings tell me that I need to do this and that this is important. But then other people are over here telling me that I'm weird and bad for having this. So now I can't trust myself. So what do I believe? Because that feeling feels really bad, but when I do this thing, I feel good. Well, I'm going to trust that more. But I'm going to try to hide it. All right.
Yeah.
That avoidance pole is evident.
Yeah. There's a lot of isolation, a lot of feeling trapped, and a lot of wanting this to sort of just be swept under the rug. Right. A common way of understanding shame is that it thrives in secrecy. It thrives in the dark. And when we get these messages, as well-intentioned as they may be, it has this effect on people, which again makes them avoidant of treatment and treatment professionals. So it is a bit of a mountain we have to climb over.
Right. And in trying to break that down, or helping someone to break that down, let's say they're experiencing that, they're experiencing shame, but they've been able to get themselves into an office, or maybe even actually let's take a step back. Someone who's listening to this podcast because they don't want to see a therapist, and they've now just found something, any sort of resource that's going to talk about it. How do we start to break down that sense of toxic shame about this?
Well, I think it starts with podcasts like this, with support groups, within supportive online communities, where we put out good information. Right, in the psychotherapy world, we talk about psychoeducation. We want to educate people. This is normal within an OCD content. This is not you. This is not a wish. This is not who you are. It's not true that having a diagnosis means you're broken. To correct all of that at that level so that you might be able to get them into the first session, because then it's on the therapist. The very first meeting, before you even agree to an appointment, there's usually some kind of interaction, a phone call, an email, right? Some kind of interaction where the therapist has a beautiful opportunity to completely remove stigma, to create a sense of understanding and acceptance, right? We call this building a therapeutic relationship, right? Therapy 101. And so all of those put together can sort of signal to the person, I am not here to judge. I am not here to say something is right or wrong or weird. I am here to build a relationship with you, and we can work on things together. But to get them into the office, that's where people like you putting podcasts out there, and writing books and doing trainings to other advocates can be really helpful. I've mentioned before, like people who run like peer support groups. I know Chrissy Hodges is big in that world. Instagram accounts. There are people out there with Instagram accounts that have tens of thousands of people. TikTok, right? The good side of social media, getting out good information. That starts to de-shame the process from the get-go.
Yeah. And this is getting to be more pervasive in society, I've noticed. A very specific example of that I've seen is, if you ever waste time on Reddit, as I'm sure you never would, if someone is going to make a comment about OCD, or I'm so OCD, or my OCD, I like the color blue because I'm so whatever the nonsense is. More and more times people will comment on that, not as an attack, but as educating. Hey, this is actually what OCD is. So, and even in those posts, those confrontations, light confrontations, I suppose, it is normalizing, or it's clarifying. This isn't what OCD is, and it's not some, quote, weird behavior. It's something specific that is a thing that is treatable and workable and known, and not something that needs to be avoided.
Yeah, like this year's OCD conference had Maria Bamford, a brilliant comedian, talk about her own personal struggles. Anytime we have people who have a lot of access to an audience that can start to use humor, but in a way that's de-shaming, because it becomes, hey, here's a real thing I had to deal with, and I'm humorously letting you know that it's not so abnormal, and the goal here ultimately, perhaps it's a little Pollyanna-ish, is that, in med school, in all doctoral and master's level programs for helping professions, including nursing, in all education professions, we are teaching people ways to decrease shame, right? Now, you don't have to be an OCD expert if you're going to become a secondary, school teacher, but you can learn how to use de-shaming language. And I think this is the zeitgeist in our culture growing right now. That's what's causing tension for some people. But my hope is that what we win is this sense of common humanity and being civil and understanding the world through the eyes of another, basic stuff.
Common respect.
Common respect. So the shame can start from there. The de-shaming process can start there. It can start between peers. It can start with parents. So anyone hearing this has an opportunity to create a space for someone that isn't starting off with shame. And then that can increase the likelihood of seeing a therapist, hopefully one that understands what you're dealing with, if it's OCD or anxiety disorders, and not get you caught up in faulty messaging, that you are actually somehow dangerous, because that is so hard to get people to come back from.
Yeah. I'm going to take another turn, if I could, and bring us back to shaming. We've talked about shame, just the experience of shame, the role of shame, toxic shame, and then you also add this element of shaming as an action.
Yeah. So often shaming is something others do to us. If we start thinking about, the examples we've given, it's like shaming can come from other people sort of tisk, at us, telling us that we're not what we should be, dismissing our experiences. So that's the shaming that can come from others. They can be as bad as bullying and ridicule and abuse, or as subtle as disagreeing with someone when they're telling you their lived experience, right? Oh, no, you just didn't do that right. right? Sometimes we see this with people who've gone through OCD treatments. They'll have not performed well, right? Their Y box doesn't drop. They don't feel a sense of quality of life improvement, and then they might get the message, "Hey, you failed treatment."
Yeah,
there it is. You just shamed them, right? As if this was a math test, right? Where you can study harder, right? Treatment failed you. Treatments do that sometimes. It ain't your fault in that way. And we get a shame message from that. And there's an opportunity to not give that shame message. Even some people will say, I've tried this one particular treatment. It could be an SSRI, it could be ERP, it could be whatever. I've tried it. It just didn't get me better. Then what they hear, either to them directly or through, information that they're reading or social media posts they might hear, yeah, but you just didn't do it right enough. Your therapist needed to add this other ingredient, or there wasn't enough vanilla extract in your ERP, right? Not enough nutmeg, and you just need that. So just do more of the same, but with a little bit of a different sauce added to it. And there's another shaming message. Either my therapist wasn't good enough, or I wasn't good enough, or we together weren't good enough. And I think we need to consider how those messages can be problematic for our clients who already feel as though, hey, a large percentage of people get better. I didn't.
Right.
And how do we talk to people about that without perpetuating a message that they're somehow broken, treatment resistant? What does that even mean?
It's not a fun term.
It's perplexing, right? Treatment resistant. Okay, so your treatment was supposed to work for 100% of people, and here's this weird person who doesn't respond to it. No.
So not only do I have OCD, which, quote, is weird and wrong and bad, but now I'm going to do the one thing that social media, everything says this is the right thing to do. CBT, ERP, and it's not working. Yeah. I'm doubly broken. I'm especially broken.
Yes. And again, like whether that's an intended message or accidental, it can come through quite frequently for the clients with lived experience, who've had, again, the lived experience of quote, failing at treatment. And I think we'd maybe change the language around that a little bit and say, hey, you're not a treatment failure and you're not treatment resistant, right? You're not a staph infection, right? You're not treatment resistant. We have an incomplete and fallible treatment, right? That's what we have. We have a series of treatments that are good. They're not great. I think we can be honest about that, and say that, hey, there are gaps in our ability to treat people. And some people fall into those gaps. That's not your problem. That's our treatment community's problem.
And I think it's hard for us as clinicians to admit that. We spend all this time, all this money learning how to do it, all this time practicing it and talking about how it's going to... I have a whole podcast dedicated to talking about how this stuff works. And it is incomplete. It's certainly better than where it was 50 years ago.
For sure.
I can't even imagine.
The numbers...
what's that?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's way better than 50 years. It's going to be way better 50 years from now, because my hope is that we don't stop learning. We didn't figure it out in the 1970s.
Nope.
We're still figuring it out. And that's only going to be good for our clients. And therapists feel shame too. I've certainly felt my fair share of shame for not helping a client to the degree that I hoped I could. And, and the story I tell myself is, well, I'm not Reed Wilson. I'm not, this other pinnacle. I'm not Sally Winston. I'm not Carl Robbins. I'm not these people who've been doing this for 40 or 50 years who clearly they know it better than I do. Yeah. I shame myself. I feel shame. I feel like I've failed the client. And sometimes our own reaction to that isn't to sort of check in and go, maybe it's just that the treatment itself wasn't going to work, right? And instead of saying that there's some dynamic between you and the client, that they didn't try hard enough, or you didn't know enough, or you didn't use the right metaphor on the right day, and Jupiter wasn't in a line with Venus, and if I just
paid more attention in that ACT training,
Yeah, right.
If I'd gone to Mike Heady's talk at the IOCDF conference, I would have just fixed him.
Because he cures everyone. The first session, every single person.
It's crazy.
And so we as therapists are not, immune, obviously, to shame. And when people are depending on us and looking to us and trusting us to help them, and then what we're doing to help them doesn't help them, there's that tendency. Am I blaming myself? Am I blaming others? Right? Mm-hmm. Attack self, attack others. Am I avoiding? Mm-hmm. And sometimes we refer out. We're just like, well, go to this other person who knows it better.
Right.
And I've certainly been a part of that, right? I'm not saying that's something I haven't done, but I'm on the other side of that now. I'm the person people refer to. Oh, you need to see Mike.
Go see.
I'm like, what am I going to do?
You fix him on the first session. You just told us you did.
Right? So I'm like, what am I going to do? So anyway.
But I think this is a really important point for the clinicians who listen to this podcast, that we feel this. I think there is a sense from clinicians. Well, all right, there is a sense for every single clinician out there, short of some people who think they're infallible and whatever to those people. But we do feel this, and there can be that sense of hyper responsibility and shame and guilt and beating ourselves up. And I wrote down that compass thing, so I keep referencing that. I've experienced all those pulls in my own practice. And, some therapists will talk to each other in kind of hushed tones of like, hey, you feel this too? You're like, yeah, I feel this too. As if we're not supposed to feel them.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not just with clients, right? Like it's with learning new things. Like when I first started learning ACT, right? Like, so I began formally in the mental health field in 2005, but I didn't get licensed to practice until 2007. Mm-hmm. And ACT was just emerging. They hadn't even had their RCT for OCD yet, but there was presentations at conferences, ACT for OCD. I saw Tuhig speak in 2008 about this. And I'm hearing all this stuff. I'm reading the ACT manual, and they're talking about RFT and, all sorts of foreign concepts and foreign language. And I'm like, maybe I'm not smart enough to be in this field. Do people just get this? Does this just make sense? And, I started to feel a little shame, maybe I don't know what I'm doing. And anytime I try to learn something new, mm-hmm. when I started learning ICBT, mm-hmm. I started learning, I don't understand this.
Right.
It's confusing to me. What do you mean? And again, if all we do is try to escape the shame that comes from trying to learn something new, we just stick to what we know. We get ourselves in our own trouble, because mm-hmm. then we become like that one trick pony that has that one thing we do, and that's it. All I do is speak English, so please learn to speak English.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you're a one trick pony, it's a very good trick. But yeah, we and that can be for some of us a way to start building, is if we're falling into that shame trap as clinicians, perhaps one way that we can help with that is to grow and to learn and to push into different things. But also, again, having that humility that we're growing and learning. We're going to mess things up.
Yeah. And us therapists can create an environment for other therapists and say, hey, listen, I have traversed this area. I like to do a lot of, I do supervision, I mentor interns, I mm-hmm. do a lot of case consultation, because I benefited so much from another person with decades more experience than me telling me, listen, that's normal. This is okay. One of the most talked about and widely attended workshops at an ADA conference a few years ago was Sally Winston, David Barlow. I'm going to forget the other person. Maybe it was Dave Carbonell or Marty Seif. But there's a panel of people who've been in the field 40 plus years, right? Mm-hmm. Wrote the textbooks, coined the terms, were around before panic disorder was a diagnosis. Right? Trailblazed it. They're up there talking about failed cases. Mm-hmm. Where we screwed up. Yes, where we screwed, and people were just sighing relief, going, "Oh my goodness, the elephant has been revealed." Right? Everyone feels this. So if we can create an environment for each other, for the clinicians listening, create an environment for each other to say, "Hey, if you don't get it, that's cool. We didn't get it at first either, right? It's okay to not get it at first, to not understand it, but keep trying, right? And that's where I think, case consultation and our own use of building therapeutic alliance can be useful within our own community.
Absolutely. So we've touched on a lot of different things. I mean, certainly normalizing the experiences that we do have for someone experiencing OCD, also for the clinicians out there listening to this. One of the I think we've maybe diverted away from the original question of shaming language. Or I don't know if we've beat that dead horse, or if we're just going to bypass the half dead horse.
Well, I think we can. It's not a super complicated topic. Shaming either is external from others, society is a person, whatever, or you can be shaming yourself, which is another way of saying attacking the self. You're going to give yourself a shame over. Right, like a comb over, but a shame over.
All right.
And I'm gonna marinate myself in this mesquite shame. And again, it's just another presentation of attacking the self. When we talk about shaming, it's just the verb of toxically, relating to yourself. Right. So back to that awareness, catching yourself in the middle of doing that, how you're doing that. And I think that's where, to perhaps shift that into what do we do about that. We've talked about compassion. I know there's a lot of work done out there about compassion and how to apply that and what that means for us. And I guess, can you talk a little bit about compassion, and is compassion the antidote to shame? Yeah, well, it's certainly incredibly important. I would say necessary, but not sufficient. From my perspective, compassion is sort of getting its due time in the spotlight. That you think the pie chart that compassion, self-compassion, which comes out of the capacity to be compassionate to others, is a part of that. So yes, we can start with compassion, self-compassion, and there's a fair amount of resources out there for people. Like, you can go on to self-compassion.org. You can take a free, psychometrically validated assessment on your level of self-compassion. And there's homework assignments that help you build your level of self-compassion. It's free. Again, that's for non-clinical populations, generally speaking, but it's out there.
And
there's TED Talks, self-compassion.org.
Self-compassion.org. Okay.
Yeah, that's Kristen Neff's website.
Okay.
And she has a validated measure of self-compassion. It breaks it down into like a couple of different, I think 5 or 6 scores that you can get.
Okay.
So anytime you're dealing with non-judgmental mindfulness, so what the research seems to be consistently showing us is that it's mindfulness, but a very specific kind of mindfulness, non-judgmental mindfulness. Building that skill is really good to building self-compassion and to decreasing shame. If we're to broaden this beyond just self-compassion and mindfulness, we're looking at compassion-focused therapy ideas. They have something called compassionate mind training, which again could be an entire series of podcasts, but in a brief description, it's looking at different aspects of like compassionate emotion and sensation. What does that compassion feel like in the body? Compassionate behaviors, compassionate awareness, compassionate imagery, and learning to build upon all of those pieces through direct practice can enhance one's level of self-compassion and compassion towards others. So that piece of the pie is, I think, really accessible. There are barriers to that. Right? Not everyone looks at self-compassion and goes, sign me up. That sounds amazing. Right? Some people look at self-compassion and think, well, that's for some other people. But I'm blue collar. I pull myself up by my bootstraps. I don't deal with any of that sort of soft towards self perspective, right? I come from a different world where that ain't gonna fly. And Russ Harris, famous ACT clinician, has a couple of ebooks. One of them is called The Barriers to Self-Compassion. It's a fantastic short read. It's free. But helping people understand their ambivalence towards practicing self-compassion is another level of intervention, psychoeducation work. If we branch outside of self-compassion, right, which again has a large part of it is mindfulness, it's direct work on building your own capacity to shift attention towards compassionate feelings, compassionate images, compassionate behaviors, again, towards the self. We start looking into other areas like, well, what other skills can be useful? And if we come out and branch out of the CBT for a minute, what the analysts and the psychodynamic folks have been very good at is noticing that shame and pride are actually flip sides of the same coin. That sort of shame can function as almost like a thermostat for pride. Right. So there's a point where like we ought to have some pride in what we do, right? I call it taking stock in a job well done. I should be able to sit with that for a few minutes, but not let it get so high that I'm braggadocious, right? That I am the bee's knees, that I'm a narcissist, right? So if pride goes unchecked, you get the braggadocious narcissist who thinks they're important, above and beyond all people. And if you go unchecked with the shame, you think you're sort of lower than the low, right? You're a barnacle on a boat, you know. And what we're looking for here is, again, a healthy balance between pride and shame. And part of this could be building pride. A way of thinking about this that's, I think, tangible is, can you take a compliment earnestly?
So hard.
If I said to you, Kevin, I think you're a really good podcast host, which is true. You're very easy to talk to. You're very easy to listen to.
I already have my response, but go ahead.
I've been interviewed by a lot of podcasts, and they're wonderful. But there's just something about the dynamic that's just easy, right? I just gave you a compliment, and you're going to be like, yes, I know, thank you.
Obviously. My response was definitely not, have you heard Kim Quinlan's podcast, though?
I talked about shame on her podcast.
Fair enough. Right. It is. I used to say, and it's a skill to build, but we'll talk about that. But yeah, it's interesting, even for myself, if I can be candid. Yeah, it's uncomfortable to receive a compliment for a number of reasons. And, I used to run a group. You'd have 8 people in the room. And if you want to see people just writhe in their chair, we did an exercise where people had to go around. Someone was in the hot seat, and they said, everyone has to go around and give this person a compliment. And the only thing that person can say is thank you. It's terrifying. It's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Right. I remember vividly, this goes back a while now, I'm just eating lunch at a conference, and I'm sitting at a table with people who I look up to, right? The founder and co-director, or executive director, I should say now, of the Institute we're at is Sally Winston. I hold her in great esteem. It's amazing to be able to work with her and learn from her. I'm sitting with her, I'm sitting with Reed Wilson, Marty Seif, I think Dave Carbonell, some sort of luminaries. Like, look at these people. They speak so well. They're so smart. I want to be them when I grow up. And Sally says to me in part of a conversation, she's like, when did you know you were smart? And it was just the most innocent question. There was nothing behind it. Just like, you're smart. When did you know you were smart? And my first was like, are you fucking with me? Like, I'm not smart. I just memorized some stuff from a manual and then repeated it. I take other people's ideas and roll with it. Is that smart? And her response to me, I can't remember exactly what it was something like, I just kind of paid you a compliment. My observation of you is this, and like, you know, you're unable to sort of hear it. Like, you know, like, yeah, that's true. I wasn't able to hear. Why is that? Now, again, that's a little shame, right? That's a small shame. That's an embarrassment.
Yeah.
But when you think about the concept of pride, which is almost non-existent in someone who has got toxic shame,
right?
It can start with learning how to take a compliment. It can start with, you know, taking stock of a job well done. You know, I'm kind of a boring person, right? But like, I like to mow my yard. And I don't like the effort necessarily, the sweat, but when I'm done, I stand on the back porch like a dad. I'm not a dad, but I, you know, like that dad meme, and I'm looking at I'm like, that looks good. That's a job well done. I take my 5 minutes and say, I did that. You know, I do the same thing when I washed my car. Same thing when I look at an intern who's grown into an amazing therapist and has really amazing things to say. Wow, look, I was part of that. Taking stock of a job well done, not being able to run from it. Don't dismiss it. Just let it be. Is practicing pride. Our clients can benefit from this, and we can help them by. You did a really good exposure you didn't think you could do. Email me, right? Do a small brag. Brag on yourself. Right? And build that pride, build that sort of self-efficacy, build that sense, because that is moving you away from toxic shame and getting you used to sort of going, I actually have, you know, value. I have good contributions. I'm a worthy person. That's moving you away. And again, it's consistent with feeling a feeling. I don't have to control it and get rid of it.
Right. I'm worthy of acknowledgement. I'm worthy of praise. The word you used in the training I watched of yours was savor.
Yes.
I wrote that down. I circled it. I can show you the page. Savor. It's just such a beautiful way to describe this. And I love that you talked about all these skills as something that you build. You build them. It isn't this light switch that we turn on, or this thing that we just go like, well, I guess I'm going to be proud of myself now, or I'm going to have self-efficacy. It's we practice this, and for those of us who beat ourselves up more than we ought to, it's something that we do need to practice. For all those weirdos out there who are very proud of themselves, good for them. They might need to practice more, humility. But for those of us on the other end of that pole, we're practicing taking that compliment, practicing acknowledging ourselves, practicing letting other people acknowledge that. I love celebrating with my clients when something good happens, or they did the hard thing, and we can take that few moments and make a big deal out of it. And all people early on in the process will say like, I took an hour-long shower, but it wasn't an hour and a half. That's a big deal.
Yeah. Us the therapists that treat adults can learn something from people who treat kids. Constantly give them little tokens of success. Here's a yo-yo, here's a slinky, here's some sidewalk chalk. Here's a certificate I printed out with your name on it for, a job well done resisting 50% of your compulsions this week. Mm-hmm. Right. And if we didn't do that, the client usually says to themselves like, well, I should be at least able to do that. So I'm not going to celebrate something I should have already been able to do. They dismiss it. They walk away from it. And again, it's not building of that pride, and it's not savoring a job well done, savoring your value.
Yes. I talk about this with folks as calling it celebrating your successes rather than celebrating our failures. It's pulled from With Winning in Mind. It's a book on sports psychology that, if written by a rifleman. And, when he's hitting 10s all day and then he finally hits that 9, he goes, what the heck? What'd I do? I messed up. I dropped the barrel, or I winked, or I flinched, and we spend a big deal, or we make a big deal out of failure. 9 is still pretty stinking good. But when we hit a 10, whatever, we don't even care.
Yeah. And again, if you think failure and shame is almost sort of the same family, right? Failure is a thing that occurred, but it's also a way you feel. I feel like a failure. And, coming with that quote with John Bradshaw, which is, failure is an event, not an identity, right?
Right.
Shame is an event, not an identity. And that's another signal when you start turning it into sort of this global self-reference. I am a failure. I'm broken. I am wrong. I am there. Now you're in a toxic relationship too. So if we can sort of copy and paste that from 15 minutes ago and put that into how to keep an eye out for
Right.
when I'm in toxic shame.
Right. So, I think for anybody out there who is listening to this and wondering, maybe they're wanting to push against their quote natural inclination towards shame or their practiced routine, and wanted to push against that. Maybe the idea of building pride and self-efficacy and self-confidence sounds nice. There's an allure to it. What's something that they can do to start with that? Is there a step one with that?
That's a really good question. I suppose there could be a step one with that, you can work in sort of generic ways, doing something you've never done before and feeling a sense of pride in that. Like I cooked a meal by myself, or, I changed the oil in my car, or I learned a new song on the guitar. Small things that can add up that are not really related to disorders. They're not related to mental health issues in particular. The other thing is I think sharing, which is a huge leap for some people, but sharing, it doesn't have to be, the biggest skeleton in your closet, but just sharing your humanness with another person, right? Seeing something in them and making them feel normal by sharing something about yourself. Right? When I see people do public speaking and I see their face get red, their voice crack, and I'm like, oh, I've been there, me too. I'll go up to them afterwards and just say, you did a really great job. First time I spoke, I was petrified, like I stared at the ground. And normalize a self-disclosure that, again, is you challenging your own shame. I'm not keeping this a secret.
Yeah.
And helping someone else. And I think that can be useful. Then we start getting into small steps on your particular topic, your anxiety disorder, your OCD. And that gets a little bit more nuanced, right? Working with a therapist on how to address that in a more systematic way. Did that answer the question?
I think it does. It does. And yes, we are here to talk about shame and, on the Fearcast, OCD and anxiety, but, shame is pervasive. It doesn't just show up for someone when they're within their OCD. They're experiencing it within their OCD. They're probably experiencing it in all other areas, and maybe that's too much to say, but they're experiencing it elsewhere in their life, right? So practicing these in small ways and letting yourself experience that positive end of things, the pride element of things, and bring yourself up from that basement. Again, I love the idea that we're not trying to eliminate these things, right? We're not trying to eliminate shame. Kind of like, and this is, I think, a misperception that some people have when they start treatment. I'm going to get into this anxiety treatment, and they're going to knock out the anxiety. I'm not going to feel anxious anymore because I met Mike Heady, we had our session, and now I should be free of it. And alas, when the anxiety is still there, or anxiety, not necessarily the anxiety disorder, but the feeling is there, it can be perceived as this failure. And that's that shift that we need to have. It's not about getting rid of it. It's about how do we experiencing it. And for some, it's how do we experience the complexity of it, of how do we feel anxiety and joy at the same time, and that saying that those things are okay. So how do we let shame be there, just like we can have pride, right? But not become not have it become our everything, that it's just one of the flavors within the emotional experience. Hope I'm not just rambling now.
No, this all makes great sense. You and I are solving the world's problems together today, aren't we?
You know what? We're putting ourselves out of business, and isn't that the purpose of our job anyways?
One thing, and I perhaps I'm a little overly sensitive to it on this podcast because I know people can listen to it, is, we absolutely can remove toxic shame, right? Like, we don't have to accept toxic shame in perpetuity, right? Just like we can treat an anxiety disorder to subclinical levels, which is effectively, getting rid of it. But what's remaining is the capacity to feel anxious about normal things you should be able to feel anxious about. Same thing with shame. Feeling shame for things for normal things. And that's the thing we want to learn how to have a healthy relationship with, is normal, healthy, functional, occasional, fleeting shame, as opposed to sort of what people might be hearing when we commonly talk about shame is the toxic, scary.
And that's a good thing to point out. Yes, we're not saying good. We're going to hold on to a little bit of toxic shame because it's a good thing to continue to have toxic shame. It's the experience of it, the shame, small s, shame, is one of the feelings within the, color wheel of emotion that we can have, right?
Yes.
I like what it said about ACT. It's that it's about feeling it's not about feeling better. It's about feeling better, letting ourselves have the natural experience of the human emotion and have the broad range of it without the expectation that we're supposed to not have one or shove one down, because we all know what happens when we try to ignore a feeling. But we take stock in it, we acknowledge it, kind of like that feelings are data, not direction. Yeah, there it is. And now what do I do with that? What do I choose to do with it, rather than responding in these unhelpful ways, kind of that compass we were talking about
Absolutely.
earlier.
Yep.
Right.
That's very well summarized. Yeah.
Well, I know I've taken a ton of your time, and this is going to be a long episode, but the topic of shame can be incredibly broad. Is there anything else that you'd want to add to give someone some ideas on where we've talked about like where they can begin, but is there anything else that you'd want to add at the tail end of this very broad conversation?
I suppose the thing I'd like to sort of get across to the consumers or clients or sufferers listening is, see if you can't find a way that if you do have toxic shame, to make it a part of your clinical treatment. So if you have someone you're working with, make it explicit. Let's work on this explicitly. It's not something we want to pay lip service to and just say, oh yeah, you feel shame. That's sad. Practice self-compassion. All right, now let's go back to exposure work, right? There is its own work, right, to be done. And for the therapists listening, dive into it, learn about it. The best place to learn about it is with your own lived experience. We don't all have panic disorder or social anxiety or OCD, but we all have shame. And I'll be willing to bet a lot of us have experience with some toxic shame. And use your own self to work through that compass or whatever works for you, right? There's a lot of different ways of thinking about shame, to see how you can understand it differently, so then you can weave it into the work with your clients. Because I don't think it's likely that you're going to run into a client, if you treat anxiety or OCD, that only feels everything but shame. Right. Oh yes, this was disgust, fear, right? A sprinkle in some anger, no, but definitely not shame. No, you're going to run into shame probably the most. So I think it's worth looking at, and treating it's different from fear. Treating it as its own distinct thing. I think that would be my message.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate all the time you've been able to share with us today and all of your expertise. Is there a place people can go to learn more about you, or any of your writings or presentations?
The best place to sort of find most up-to-date kind of writings and podcasts and webinars would probably be the website that's for the group practice that I co-direct, which is anxietyandstress.com, all spelled out. And you can find some articles on there. You can find podcasts, not just from me, but from a lot of other really great clinicians. That'd be the go-to spot.
Awesome. And if people have questions about shame, would you be willing to jump back on a future episode and answer some questions?
Happy to.
Awesome. Well, Mike, I'll let you go here, but thank you so much for your time on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for making it through that episode. So if you have questions about shame or would like a little bit more information about it, send me a message over at fearcastpodcast.com, or again, send me a message over at Instagram, fearcastpodcast over there, and I'll try to get Mike on to discuss any specific questions that I can't field, or if Mike has availability, just to have him on to extend his expertise. So everybody, please remember that the Fearcast is not a substitute for psychotherapy. If you need a little bit of guidance and a little bit of help in your recovery, go over to fearcastpodcast.com, click on the submit, or assuming not submit a question, click on the find help link, and you can find a little bit of information for you there. So until next time, everybody, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously. Bye.